Okay, everyone, let's get started. I know folks are probably going to trickle in, and this part will be recorded. But welcome. For those who may not know me, I am a Prince Albert III, affectionately known as Prince the Culture Keeper. I'm the founder and the head of the Culture Keeper Circle, the symbol you see on the screen today. And welcome to our ACHP Section 106 emergency meeting. Since we have some new guests tonight, I'll start with a quick overview of our organization's purpose and work before we dive into what has brought us here today. Okay. So the Culture Keeper Circle is the national grassroots coalition of Indigenous, African descendant, Latina, Asian Pacific Islander, and other cultural communities formed to protect the cultural resources that document our contributions to the United States of America. As an organization, we track threats to cultural resources, we convene communities and experts to solve for those threats, and we celebrate culture and advocacy. Our organization is tracking threats across all 11 agencies that you see on the slide, and a few other operating agencies beyond this list, like DOJ, for example, the Department of Justice. But if you have not yet, please visit our AI-powered tracker to learn more about the threats to our cultural resources. You can visit on our website, www.culturekeepercircle.org/tracker. Okay. We are gathered here today fulfilling actually two of the obligations of our mission, right? We're tracking the latest threat to our cultural resources this week, and we're convening to try to address this threat in particular. Cultural resources encompass the people, places, practices, and treasures which sustain our cultural lifeways. So cultural resources are not merely museum objects or tourist attractions. For us, cultural resources are what teach us about ourselves and what keep us us. So the loss of any one resource degrades the effectiveness of all other resources. The loss of any one resource jeopardizes the integrity of the entire cultural system. And in my view, this first-person plural approach to understanding cultural resources grounds the way our coalition members understand this issue in particular. Okay. I'm going to let some folks in. Okay. So on Friday evening, July 17th, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation promulgated a comprehensive proposal to overhaul Section 106 pretty much in its entirety. Members will vote on this on Friday without the text being public, and we will discuss the speed, the secrecy, and other absurdities of this process in this rulemaking, let alone the heart-wrenching substantive proposal itself. And here's our presentation agenda for tonight. Okay, so we're going to start with just a foundational overview of the National Historic Preservation Act and how Section 106 and its process was originally designed to work. From there, we will unpack the devastating effects of the proposed rule changes and expose some procedural improprieties behind the rollout. And then finally, we're going to outline our strategy for how we can fight back. And we're going to open up the discussion to coordinate next steps. Also open for any questions as well. Okay, so what is the National Historic Preservation Act? Well, the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, or the NHPA, is the primary federal law governing the preservation of cultural and historic resources in the United States. The NHPA enacted 4 important measures we all know today. First, it created the National Register of Historic Places, or the National Register. This is the official list comprising of districts, sites, buildings, geological features, and objects significant in history and prehistory of what is now the United States of America. The law tasks the National Park Service with managing and overseeing the National Register. Second, the National Historic Preservation Act created the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, or the ACHP, the body which advises the President and Congress on matters concerning historic preservation. This is the body that has promulgated the comprehensive changes to Section 106 we're talking about today. Third, the National Historic Preservation Act mandated that states create state historic preservation offices, or SHPOs, and invited tribal governments to create tribal historic preservation officers, or TIPOs, sometimes called. And fourth, the NHPA created Section 106, the consultative process, which is by far probably the most widely known provision of this act. This is the procedural consultation involving community members, organizations with a stake in their own cultural and historical resources, and the federal government. It requires all federal agencies consider how these actions, called undertakings, affect properties listed on or eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. So agencies must consult with preservation professionals and the public to avoid or mitigate any adverse effects to these resources. Okay. So a helpful way I like to think about it is the NHPA creates three things: the list, right? The National Register of Historic Places, this comprehensive list of all places on that the federal government recognizes as important historical or cultural places. Second, it creates these bodies of people, right? The Federal Advisory Council, as well as state and tribal officers, people who help with the preservation and coordinating it at local levels. And then it also creates the process, the mechanism by which these entities engage with the public and community stakeholders. Okay. Now, interestingly, here's a bit of legislative history here. So the NHPA was enacted in response to the widespread destruction of historic neighborhoods and landmarks and geologic features during rapid urbanization, industrialization, and highway construction after World War II. Okay, so the NHPA fundamentally transformed the U.S. approach to historic preservation by creating a comprehensive federal level framework for protecting historic places and the cultural and archaeological resources of public interest. Okay, now let's look at Section 106, the consultation process as it is currently designed to work. Okay, so you have step 0. I'm calling it step 0. Okay. 0 is the statutory prerequisite of an undertaking. So there has to be a finding that an undertaking, what we call a federal undertaking, is taking place. A federal undertaking is a project or activity or a program funded in whole or in part under the direct or indirect jurisdiction of a federal agency. Okay, we will hear more about this later. But then you see, once the agency has found that there is a federal undertaking, then there has to be the council, the advisory council will convene, identify, and invite SHPOs, TIPOs, other consulting parties into this consultative process. Okay, and this is the beginning of the process. Step 2, they will identify historic properties within the area of potential effects of this government undertaking. So think about a geological area, and there may be more than one historic property that is affected by whatever undertaking is taking place. So they'll identify what all of those are in the APE. And then third, they'll assess the potential adverse effects of this project on these identified historic properties. Finally, they'll work to resolve these adverse effects, ordinarily through consultation, memorialized in what we call a binding memorandum of agreement. Okay, this is the typical process as it works now. All right, here's a vertical version of that infographic from the previous slide, just because it's easier to match together. And we'll refer back to this throughout the presentation because I just find it easier to understand the changes that are being proposed as you understand them impacting the current 106 process. Okay, so we talked about a federal undertaking. And this image on the right outlines the three main types of federal undertakings, because I went through that very quickly. Okay. The first is a direct federal action where the agency itself is building, managing, or disposing of something typically, right? And you see some examples on the right-hand side. Okay. Building a military infrastructure project or a federal building is being constructed in a certain area, etc. Then we have this second group of federal undertakings where the project, activity, or program in question is funded in whole or in part under the direct or indirect jurisdiction of a federal agency. Okay, examples would be HUD-assisted public housing that's built with federal grant dollars, or sites built with community development grants. Highway transit funding. So again, the construction of highways is contemplated here. And then finally, and most importantly, even when the government is not doing any building at all, but it's still involved in the licensing, certification, or permitting to greenlight a major private sector contract, this private sector contract or this private sector project still counts as a federal undertaking because the federal government issues some kind of permit, license, or certification for its construction. Okay, so that brings it under Section 106 law. Think about things like an FCC license for a cell tower, a FERC certification for a pipeline, a natural gas pipeline or oil pipeline. Think about data center construction. Okay, these are all very relevant things and all relevant to each of you in the audience. Okay. Then we have I want to highlight some important history here in this very controversial, but I think true and important take, right? Just as African Americans shared experiences of bloodshed and strategic movement building that created the 19th and 20th century civil rights regimes that made a way for all of us to exercise our civil rights and economic participation, so too did indigenous communities across Turtle Island and Alaska and Hawaii work to pass the 1996 amendment to the National Historic Preservation Act, codifying the rights of non-federally recognized indigenous communities, African descendant, Latine, Asian, Pacific Islander, and other community stakeholders to participate in 106 consultation processes. And honestly, there is no Section 106 without indigenous elders, ancestors, and advocates. So this is really, then the rest of this is the rest of the 106 process that is familiar to you from the previous slide. Okay. Now, the proposed rules attack every juncture of the current 106 process with multiple blows per juncture. Okay. So far, I have counted 38 dangerous provisions in this 50-page text that convert Section 106 from a tool for community resource protection to a weapon against cultural and historical resources that our communities cherish. So in Puerto Rican Spanish, there's a term capicu which typically means like a KO, a knockout, or a major blow in a fight. So you understand when I say that this first edit, I'm going to tell you, is a kapiku to Section 106 as we know it. And that is the narrowing definition of an undertaking. Okay. I spent so much time talking about a federal undertaking because this new proposed rule totally redefines it and hollows it out. Okay. So remember the three types of federal undertakings we talked about? Well, the proposed language narrows federal undertakings needing advisory to just direct federal actions. Therefore, projects that receive federal financial assistance, like our highway construction or community development buildings or HUD buildings, no longer merit 106 review at all. Okay. So these sites that affect historic places, historic districts, sacred sites, no longer triggers 106 review. Likewise, cell towers, pipelines, and data centers, wink, 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 could irreparably harm cultural property in historic places, districts, and sites also no longer will merit 106 review. Okay, so they're not triggering review at all. Only direct federal action, direct buildings, military installations, other federal building infrastructure. That's it. Okay. Next, the proposal inserts a new dramatic declaration into the opening of the rule, explicitly stating that Section 106 is purely procedural and does not impose any substantive preservation outcome or obligations. Okay. In this new text, it's a litigation shield written for when this inevitably goes to court. And it's designed to defeat any future community claim that a federal agency has a duty to save a sacred or historic place. Okay. Together, the Culture Keeper Circle's analysis confirms that the proposed changes to these respective sections, 800.1 and 800.3, create a fundamental re-engineering designed to diminish community voice and historic protection. Okay, so 800.3 creates this jurisdictional wall that can sweep large categories of federal actions or undertakings out of 106 review. And then, the proposed Section 800.1 explicitly authorizes agencies to unilaterally override historic preservation concerns. And this is in the text, by balancing them against other interests such as economic development. So they're going to weigh, right, whether this is in the interest of historic preservation or whether economic development will outweigh any claim or desire or need for historic preservation protections. Okay. Next, we see the proposed changes effectively hollow out consultation by converting consultation from this relational interactive dialogue into a purely transactional notification. Okay. They remove core requirements like the agency needs to discuss views and seek agreement. Now, no agreement. It's not a two-way street anymore to achieve agreement. It's just a one-way street where the agency just has to listen, not talk, or agree. Okay. Second, there's the conversion from it converts this, what we call consultation, into just a notice and comment. So there may be this elective notice and comment period that council does not need to actually create a notice and comment period. It's totally optional. And the only way people can, even engage in this or weigh in on whether and how this will hurt cultural resources is literally if the agency decides to open up a notice and comment period. Okay. And then there's the waiver by silence provision. Okay. So if there is no party meaningfully responds to this with any objections within 60 days, it's automatically deemed that there are no objections and there is no other time that an objection can be raised in the 106 process. So silence or an inability to respond in time is legally presumed to be consent, and it permanently waives community standing. Okay. Now we're going to discuss the next two together. Okay. So this proposed rule strikes the foundational language requiring federal agencies to respect tribal sovereignty, the unique government to government relationship. So text about the unique government to government relationship or recognizing tribal sovereignty is almost unilaterally struck from the rule. So you'll see it talk about, you know, Native Americans and indigenous communities and Native Hawaiian communities. But in terms of representing sovereignty or recognizing any kind of sovereignty or government to government relationship, that is completely stricken from this legislation. Also, it fundamentally weakens step one of this traditional process, where agencies are supposed to identify and invite tribes to the negotiating table. So the proposal deletes this critical recognition, and it also prevents indigenous communities from weighing in on off-reservation cultural resources. So any cultural resources that may not be on tribal land, but may be close by, closely related to tribal communities, this rewrite forecloses their ability to even weigh in on them, and the agency does not have to invite them to consult on their own cultural resources, especially and explicitly when they fall outside of indigenous territory. Okay. So ultimately, what the 92 amendments put in place to ensure indigenous nations are recognized as sovereign consulting parties, from day one, this rule strips away. Okay. Then this additional consulting parties category is also stripped away from the rule completely, which shuts the door for African descendant, Latine, Asian organizations and groups to be welcomed to the negotiating table on behalf of their constituencies to weigh in on the future of their cultural resources. So by striking this catch-all, essentially the federal government removes its obligation to even identify or invite non-federally recognized tribes, grassroots stakeholders from formal consultation. And it also in particular, you know, targets participation by Black burial ground groups or Black churches or other, you know, historically Black districts in particular that have and are stewards and consulting parties to these sites. In the traditional process, they no longer have to be consulted at all. So I want to highlight that this is a very serious material change from the current rules that they pretty much leave up to agency discretion to include these groups. But now there's actually no pathway for people who are stewarding historic cemeteries or freedmen towns or other sacred historic and cultural sites to even be invited to the table. Okay, so this is participatory erasure. Okay. So now that the historic property definition is definitely a copy-cool to the 106 regime, let's get into the text on this one, okay? Because there's a fundamental rewriting of even what a historic property is. Okay. So under the NHPA's current framework, natural features like sacred mountains, bodies of water, sprawling cultural landscapes can qualify for federal protection as what we call TCPs, or traditional cultural properties. Often people assume that these properties and protections only apply to sacred land of federally recognized indigenous tribes or Hawaiian organizations. But this is a misconception. This exact framework is vital for protecting heritage of African descendant communities as well, like traditional baptismal rivers and hush harbors. These are the ancestral landscapes of indigenous communities as well, who also identify as Latine, okay, in the Southwest in particular and along the border. So this new rule actually introduces a strict two-part test designed to strip away recognition. So under the test, a site it has to either have a tangible human improvement or some tangible human improvement to the site. Okay. So this strips away, any other kind of geological features that have not had what a Eurocentric view calls tangible human improvements. And the area under protection must be geologically compact, okay, or in some compact footprint. So again, this further invalidates, quote, non-compact or unimproved natural features like mountains, valleys, bodies of water, or other ethnographic landscapes. So this is a devastating blow, okay? And it particularly has this text in the dark red that says, for the avoidance of doubt, non-compact, unimproved natural features, and it names these things in particular, they do not qualify. So the law is very clear that it is attacking these non-traditional or non-edifice based cultural resources as not meriting any kind of protection as historic properties. Okay. So also in the current 106 process, remember that area of potential effects that was kind of deliberately broad so that we could understand all of the impacts to historic sites and community resources in the footprint of a government federal undertaking? Well, the text also shrinks this area of potential effect. Okay. So this area is shrunken to pretty much exclude any indirect effects. So if it is not actually in the footprint of a building or of a government undertaking, then it will not be considered. So things that affect, for example, water quality or noise pollution or other kinds of effects that are not physically and materially impacting the cultural resource will not merit any kind of protection. They will not be considered in the area of potential effects under this new rule. Okay. Okay. It also guts the adverse effect analysis. So remember, in the process, once we identify historic properties, there has to be some, comprehensive assessment as to the effects of the undertaking on these historic properties and resources. Well, this step now is entirely up to the agency and the advisory council to pretty much create its own report. So it doesn't need to consult. It will come up with its own report as to whether there are any visual, atmospheric, or auditory intrusions on the land. And then it could write whatever it deems as the adverse effects in lieu of communities. And it could even write, there's no adverse effect. It also makes public participation completely discretionary. Again, so public comments, not required, okay? And in most cases, they will likely not require public participation. Also, the effect requiring a material alteration. This is what I mentioned earlier about the fact that, if a government undertaking does not directly, physically, materially touch any, cultural resource or site that is, that risks being affected, then it will not count as really being any kind of effect that needs to be protected under 106. Then agency control over every deadline. So this pretty much says that the advisory council They can extend or shorten deadlines for responses from tribes, SIPOs. They can shorten or, of course, completely eliminate any kind of public, participation or comment period. Any guidelines or any other deadlines that are important in the process, this essentially allows them to unilaterally shrink them with no notice except by email. And then emergencies. Think about things that, become urgent after the fact. And this provision completely bypasses step 3. And by deleting the mandate to develop proactive emergency procedures. So think about things like, unleashing heavy machinery into sacred sites without assessing the impacts first. Then, after some destruction has happened to a cultural landscape, and there's no proactive measures, there's no emergency measures there, the agency will unilaterally just decide what it wants to do after a site has already been hurt. And of course, a community would likely go to court on this. And the record about whether the agency had the responsibility to create, some emergency action plan, or whether it, thought about adverse effects, and whether it, worked to mitigate them, all of that is pretty much absolved from this process. So any emergency scenario will pretty much just be discovered in real time, and the harm happens in real time, and the agency is absolving itself from any requirement to essentially mitigate that in advance. Okay. And it really goes on and on, right? Think about unilateral decision making, covenants to not sue. So this provision essentially means, and I really want to highlight that the memorandums of agreement turn into memorandums of decision, where essentially we don't need, the agency is saying it doesn't need any input from anyone else to decide the future of our cultural resources, regardless as to whether there's some precedent for protection or not. And so really the outcome of that, this memorandum, is really this one-way issuing of what the agency will do to approve a project. Think about the removing of other accountability valves right throughout this. And that memorandum also has this covenant to not sue. So if in an event that an agency does offer a memorandum of understanding or issue this memorandum of decision that is binding, it acts as this like coercive legal shield that pretty much takes away or tries to strip communities' rights to sue, or affected communities' rights to sue for any damage or for any lack of process or lack of foresight in adverse effects. Okay. And then there's also this severability clause. Okay. The severability clause means that even though one part of this might get struck down, which they obviously think this will get challenged in court and parts of it may get struck down, the rest of it survives. So you have this, then this obviously comes from corporate law. So many think some corporate law firms probably wrote it, right? But this idea of the covenant to not sue and the severability clause is like this corporate fingerprint on really this rule change that will obviously greatly benefit corporations. Okay. To wrap up, I think it is important to talk about the procedural improprieties here. So, late Friday evening, the vice chairman, without a formal chairman, right? So the chairman position is vacant on this commission. And in January, there was just an announcement of a slew of Trump appointed people on the advisory council. Well, on Friday, he drops this 50-page comprehensive rule statement by email. There's not going to be a public meeting. There's going to be this sweeping overwrite, and there's a 1-week clock. So people are supposed to, raise their concerns via email, but it will be voted on. And really, there's, scuttlebutt that essentially the vice chairman pretty much said that, like, when they meet on Friday, all they need is a quorum. So the advisory council has 23 members. Only 7 are needed to pass this rule pretty much into law, right? And this is such a comprehensive overwrite of a rule. It feels like it's essentially taking and usurping the power from the legislative branch to essentially write law. Okay. So this agency is taking it upon itself to write law in this very hackneyed, irregular process that is really worth us raising. So this will probably become law on Friday. And so really we need to think about what we're going to do after this. Okay, so some of the things that I think are things that we could and should do. We are starting a rapid response list, and we're working with one of our coalition partners that I will that I'll mention on the next slide. And please pledge to comment, right? This will open up for a public comment. So even though the actual rule makes public comment discretionary in actual 106 processes, this rule override will be open to some kind of public comment. And in that period, we really have to write, right? We have to think broadly and section by section about what rules and how these rules really do not work. And then 3, we need to bring more allies into this space. This affects so many communities, so many community organizations that are just not necessarily in coalition right now. But we really have to build that, because this really is the four alarm fire of cultural heritage and cultural resources. And so thinking about to fight back, Cultural Heritage Partners is a law firm that really is leading the charge. We are working with them on trying to help coordinate litigation for this eventually, as well as comments for this rule rewrite. And so please, talk to us, and I'm happy to share this presentation with folks afterward, so that you can, we can strategize on what to write and how to write. This is not going to be just a cookie cutter, hey, copy and paste these comments and submit them on regulations.gov, okay? Because there have been edits and there have been this comprehensive overhaul of how comments are counted. So comments that are substantially similar, the same text, are counted as one comment. Okay, so we really have to get in the weeds on this, but really help bring others up to a place where they can really submit meaningful comments, and we really need to flood these comments. This is essentially like the apocalypse of cultural heritage management, and it's a very dangerous time. So with that, I'll open it up to questions or comments by anyone.